May 20th, 1989. 5:10 a.m. Trabzon Airport, Turkey. The air inside the control tower is thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of aging electronics. It's the dead of night, the kind of silence that feels heavy. Suddenly, the silence shatters. A ghost appears on the radar, a jagged green blip that shouldn't exist. It's moving at over 500 knots, dropping out of the clouds, screaming across the Black Sea from the north. Unknown aircraft, you are entering restricted Turkish airspace. Identify yourself and turn back immediately. The controller shouts into his headset. Nothing but static. No flight plan. No transponder code. The blip keeps descending, aimed straight for the heart of the civilian runway like a spear. The controllers exchange frantic looks. Is it a malfunction? A kamikaze? Or the start of a Third World War? Then, out of the pre-dawn mist, a shape begins to crystallize. It's not just a plane. It's the stuff of NATO's worst nightmares. A MiG-29 Fulcrum, the crown jewel of the Soviet Union's air supremacy, is shrieking toward the tarmac. Its twin Klimov engines are roaring like a dying god, a sound so violent it vibrates the very glass of the tower. The jet slams onto the runway, tires shrieking, trailing a thick cloud of blue smoke as it fights to bleed off lethal speed. It comes to a shuddering halt just feet from the grass. The ground crew stands paralyzed. They expect a squadron of Soviet Spetsnaz to pour out. They expect an invasion. Instead, the canopy slowly slides back. A lone figure in a high-pressure flight suit climbs down. His movements are heavy, erratic. He's clutching his right arm, and as he steps onto the tarmac, the staff sees it. Blood. Dark, Soviet blood is staining the gray asphalt. A lone Turkish guard, his hands trembling, raises his rifle. The pilot doesn't reach for his holster. He looks the guard dead in the eye, gasps for air through the smell of jet fuel, and utters the only 4 English words he has ever memorized. Words that would send shockwaves from Moscow to Washington. Finally, I am an American. But Alexander Zuyev wasn't a spy. He was the Soviet Union's golden boy. To understand why he was bleeding on a foreign runway, we have to go back to the moment the machine he loved began to rot from the inside out. To understand the magnitude of Alexander Zuyev's betrayal, you first have to understand what he was walking away from. He wasn't a desperate man with nothing to lose. Quite the opposite. In the rigid, iron-fisted hierarchy of the Soviet Union, Zuyev was a prince. Born in 1961, he was a child of the system. He didn't just believe in the communist machine, he was its finest product. By 1982, he had graduated from the Armavir Higher Military Aviation School, the Soviet equivalent of Top Gun. He wasn't just a pilot, he was an apex predator of the skies. While others struggled with aging interceptors, Zuyev was fast-tracked. At just 22 years old, he became one of the first pilots in the entire USSR hand-picked to fly the MiG-29 Fulcrum. To the west, the Fulcrum was a ghost story, a jet so advanced it could outturn and outfight anything America had in the air. Zuyev was the man the Kremlin trusted with their most lethal secret. But his status went beyond the cockpit. In the Soviet Union, who you knew was more important than what you flew. Zuyev had played the game perfectly. He married the daughter of the chief of staff of his air division. In military terms, he was royalty. He had the best apartment, the best food, and a career path that pointed straight to the stars. He was a poster child for the Soviet dream, a man destined for the history books. He was being groomed for the most elite posting in the country. Test pilot school at Akhtubinsk. It was the final step toward becoming an immortal in the world of aviation. He had the flight hours, he had the pedigree, he had the political backing. On paper, Alexander Zuyev had won. But as he climbed into the cockpit of the world's most dangerous fighter jet, Something was beginning to shift. Behind the medals and the high society weddings, the golden boy was starting to see the rot behind the curtain. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The first crack in his loyalty didn't come from a spy or a bribe. It came from a tragedy over the Sea of Japan that the Kremlin tried to bury. September 1st, 1983. A date that would be etched in blood in the annals of the Cold War. Over the frigid waters of the Sea of Japan, a Soviet Su-15 interceptor locks its radar onto a target. The pilot pulls the trigger. 2 missiles streak through the night, slamming into the side of a Boeing 747. It wasn't a bomber. It wasn't a spy plane. It was Korean Airlines. Flight 007. 269 innocent civilians, including a U.S. congressman, plummeted into the dark ocean. In the aftermath, the Soviet propaganda machine went into overdrive. They called it a provocative spy mission. They denied the shoot-down for days. They even sent trawlers to disturb the wreckage, so international recovery teams couldn't find the truth. Alexander Zuyev, like every other loyal officer, swallowed the official line. He believed he was the shield of a righteous nation. But 2 years later, the truth found its way into his cockpit. A close friend, a fellow pilot who had been stationed on Sakhalin Island the night of the tragedy, pulled Zuyev aside. In a whisper that smelled of fear and cheap vodka, he told him the truth that wasn't in the newspapers. 10 days before the shoot-down, a massive Arctic gale had knocked out the primary Soviet radar installations on the Kamchatka Peninsula. The region was blind. But in the Soviet system, failure was a death sentence. Terrified of the Politburo's wrath, local commanders did the unthinkable. They reported to Moscow that the radar was fixed. It was a lie. When KAL-007 veered slightly off course, the Soviet Air Force scrambled jets to intercept a ghost they couldn't properly see. They murdered 269 people because a few men were too scared to admit a machine was broken. Zuyev sat in silence as the weight of the lie crushed him. He realized he wasn't flying for a superpower. He was flying for a lethal bureaucracy built on a foundation of cowardice. The uniform suddenly felt heavy. The cockpit felt small. But if KAL-007 was a crack in the glass, the next disaster would shatter the entire window. Because while the military lied about the sky, the state was about to lie about the very air the Soviet people breathed. If the lies of KAL-007 were a crack in the system's armor, Chernobyl was the moment the entire structure began to melt. April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explodes in a flash of lethal blue light. For the rest of the world, it was a terrifying mystery. For the Soviet leadership, it was a PR disaster to be managed. But for Alexander Zuyev, it was the ultimate betrayal of the people he was sworn to defend. While the graphite fire spewed invisible poison into the atmosphere, the Kremlin remained silent. But behind that silence, a different story was unfolding. Within 48 hours, high-ranking party members and their families, those with the right connections and the red cards, began a quiet, panicked evacuation. They packed their bags, boarded private transport, and fled to the safety of the South. But what about the others? What about the families of the men Zuyev flew with? Ordinary citizens weren't told a thing. For 2 weeks, children in the surrounding areas continued to play in the dirt. They drank fresh milk contaminated with iodine 131. They breathed the air that was literally glowing with radiation. They were sacrificed to protect the prestige of the state. Years later, Zuyev's voice would tremble when he spoke of this moment. "How would you feel?" he asked in an interview. "Would you feel like this is a fair system? Would you feel like you would be happy to defend this system?" He was still wearing the wings of a Soviet pilot. He was still the golden boy. But inside, the fire was out. He looked at his MiG-29. The the pinnacle of Soviet engineering, and realized it was nothing more than a high-tech cage. He wasn't a guardian of the people. He was a guard for a graveyard. The rot was everywhere. And soon, the machine wouldn't just be lying to its people. It would be asking Zuyev to turn his lethal weapons against them. The final straw didn't happen in a nuclear plant, but in the streets of Georgia, where the army traded its honor for sharpened spades. The cracks in Alexander Zuyev's soul had become a canyon, but the Soviet machine was about to pour blood into it. April 9th, 1989. Tbilisi, the capital of Soviet Georgia. Thousands of civilians had gathered in front of the government house. They weren't armed with rifles or grenades. They held candles. They sang songs. They carried signs calling for independence. It was a sea of families, students, and elders, hoping for a future that didn't involve the iron grip of Moscow. At 4 a.m., the music stopped. The Soviet leadership didn't send negotiators. They sent the paratroopers. And they didn't just come with shields. They came with toxic gas and sapper spades, small entrenching tools usually used for digging trenches. But on this night, the soldiers had filed the edges of those spades until they were as sharp as razors. What followed wasn't a riot control. It was a harvest of human lives. They hacked into the crowds. They used the poison gas in enclosed spaces. By the time the sun rose, 21 people were dead, most of them women and girls. Hundreds more were left gasping for air, their lungs burned by chemicals. Zuyev heard the details within hours. The military, the brotherhood he had dedicated his life to, had used combat tactics against defenseless women. "I was shocked to the depths of my soul," he would later recall. But the horror didn't stop at the news report. A whisper began to circulate through the corridors of his airbase. His regiment, his elite MiG-29s, were being placed on standby. If the protests spread, if more people dared to ask for freedom, Zuyev would be ordered to fly his multi-million-dollar killing machine against his own citizens. The man who had spent 7 years training to defend his country was now being asked to become its executioner. In that moment, Alexander Zuyev made a choice. He wouldn't just leave the military. He wouldn't just resign. He would strike a blow that would leave the Soviet Empire reeling. He had 6 weeks to plan, 6 weeks to become a ghost in his own life. Alexander Zuyev had 6 weeks. To his wife, he was the same elite pilot. To his commanders, he was the dependable golden boy. But in the margins of his military life, he was a saboteur. He knew the math. If he tried to steal a MiG-29 in broad daylight, he'd be dead before his wheels left the tarmac. The Soviet Air Force was a hornet's nest. Touch one jet, and a dozen more would scramble to hunt you down. He didn't just need to leave, he needed to paralyze the entire regiment. His weapon of choice wasn't a missile, it was a sedative. Zuyev walked into a local pharmacy, calmly telling the pharmacist he'd been struggling with insomnia. He bought a massive quantity of sleeping pills. In the paranoid atmosphere of a Soviet military town, no one questioned a stressed pilot. Then, he went home and did something unthinkable for a fighter ace. He began to bake. The evening of May 19th, 1989. Gudauta Air Base, Soviet Georgia. Zuyev walked into the squadron's common room carrying a large, homemade cake. He was beaming. He announced to his fellow pilots, his brothers, that his wife was expecting a baby boy. It was a celebration. In the grim, high-pressure world of Soviet aviation, a moment of joy was a rare gift. He sliced the cake personally. He handed a piece to every man in the room. He watched them eat. He watched the men he had flown with for years, men who trusted him with their lives in the air, swallow the poison he had prepared in his own kitchen. Within an hour, the room went quiet. It wasn't the silence of sleep. It was the heavy, unnatural stillness of a mass sedation. At least 7 men would later be hospitalized. their systems nearly shut down by the dosage. Zuyev stood among the slumped bodies of his comrades. The golden boy was gone. In his place was a man who had just burned every bridge he ever crossed. He stepped out into the cool Georgian night and cut the telephone lines to the base. The regiment was down. The path to the flight line was clear, or so he thought. Because as he approached the dark silhouettes of the MiG-29s, he realized he had made one fatal miscalculation. 2 men hadn't eaten the cake, and they were standing between Zuyev and his only way out. The silence of the Gudauta airbase was now his enemy. As Zuyev approached the flight line, the towering shadows of the MiG-29s looked like sleeping giants. But guarding them were 2 men who were very much awake. Zuyev had deliberately skipped them during the cake ceremony. They were on active duty, and offering them food would have been an immediate red flag. He waited in the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hoped the second shift, the sedated shift, would arrive to relieve them. They never did. One of the guards, frustrated by the delay, finally headed toward the squadron house to find out what was wrong, leaving his colleague alone. This was it. The narrowest of windows. Zuyev stepped out of the dark, walking toward the remaining guard with a forced calmness. He told the man that the relief was running late, and that he, a captain, would cover the post. It was a bold lie. The guard, tired and eager to leave, started to walk away. But then, the first guard returned. He had seen the common room. He had seen the unconscious bodies of the elite pilots of the Soviet Union. He was running now, shouting, his rifle unslung. The 2 men collided in the dark between the massive jet engines. It wasn't a movie fight. It was a desperate, ugly struggle on the cold asphalt. They wrestled for control, the smell of jet fuel mixing with the metallic tang of fear. Both men drew their sidearms. Crack, crack. Muzzle flashes illuminated the underbelly of the MiG-29 for a split second. The guard took multiple hits and slumped to the ground. But Zuyev wasn't unscathed. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his right arm. A 9mm round had torn through his flesh. Bleeding heavily, his vision blurring, Zuyev scrambled up the ladder into the cockpit of a MiG that had been sitting in storage. His hands, slick with his own blood, fumbled with the switches. He hit the start sequence. Nothing. Silence. This is it, he thought. This is where I die. He closed his eyes, forced a breath into his lungs, and remembered his training. He started the sequence again, from the very beginning. This time, the jet roared to life. But as the engine spun up, he realized he had made a terrible mistake. In his panic, he had forgotten the safety locks on the guns. He was flying into the most heavily defended airspace in the world, and he was completely defenseless. The MiG-29 screamed down the runway, its afterburners carving a twin path of violet fire through the Georgian night. Alexander Zuyev slammed the gear handle up. He was airborne, but he wasn't safe. He was flying a cold jet, an aircraft pulled from storage that hadn't been fully prepped for combat. His right arm was a mess of torn muscle and warm blood, making every micro-adjustment of the control stick a journey into agony. But the pain was secondary to the terror. Behind him, the Gudauta airbase was waking up. He knew the protocol. Even sedated, the Soviet machine would eventually find its feet. Somewhere in the dark, radar dishes were beginning to swivel, searching for the ghost that had just stolen their crown jewel. To survive, Zuyev did what only the best can do. He dropped. He pushed the nose down until he was skimming just 50 feet above the waves of the Black Sea. This is nap of the earth flying. At this altitude, the sea spray was hitting his canopy, and the radar waves from the Soviet coast would bounce right over him, lost in the clutter of the water. But it was a suicide mission. One wrong twitch, one sudden cramp in his wounded arm, and the MiG-29 would disintegrate against the water like a glass bottle against concrete. 240 kilometers of open water lay between him and freedom. 15 minutes. In the cockpit, the only lights were the eerie green glow of the instruments and the flashing warning light of a low-fuel sensor. He was flying blind, without a navigator, without a radio escort, and without a way to defend himself. Every second felt like an hour. He looked at the horizon, searching for the coastline of Turkey, the edge of NATO. He was a man without a country, a traitor to an empire, suspended in a 20-ton metal tube between a dark sky and a darker sea. Finally, the Turkish coast appeared on his radar, but as he crossed the border, the radio crackled to life with a voice that wasn't friendly. The Trabzon tower was screaming at him in a language he barely understood, ordering the unidentified intruder to turn back or be shot down. Zuyev didn't turn. He couldn't. He was out of fuel, out of blood, and out of time. At 5:10 a.m., the wheels of the MiG-29 kissed the tarmac of Trabzon airport. It wasn't a graceful landing. It was a desperate arrival. Alexander Zuyev shut down the massive engines, and for the first time in hours, the only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and his own ragged breathing. He climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked in blood, and collapsed onto the Turkish soil. A young guard approached, rifle leveled at Zuyev's chest. The pilot looked up, his face pale from blood loss, and wheezed out the 4 words he had rehearsed like a prayer. Finally, I am an American. He wasn't in America yet, but the shockwaves of his arrival reached Washington before the sun was fully up. Back in Moscow, the Kremlin was in a state of absolute fury. Within hours, the Soviet Foreign Ministry summoned the Turkish ambassador. The demand was simple and terrifying. Return the aircraft. Return the traitor. Now. Turkey was caught in a geopolitical vice. To appease the Soviet giant next door, they agreed to return the MiG-29. A day later, the jet was towed back across the border, escorted by Turkish fighters. But when it came to Zuyev, Turkey held its ground. They refused to hand him over to a firing squad. Zuyev was quietly moved to a U.S. military hospital, and then the door to his room opened to reveal a group of men in sharp suits who didn't care about his health. They cared about what was inside his head. The CIA had arrived. For the American intelligence community, Zuyev wasn't just a defector. He was a Rosetta Stone for Soviet air power. For months, he sat in a secure room, pouring out every secret he knew. He explained the MiG-29's radar weaknesses, its dogfighting maneuvers, and the tactical flaws that sat hidden beneath its sleek fuselage. 2 years later, when U.S. pilots flew into the skies over Iraq during Operation Desert Storm, they weren't guessing. They knew exactly how to kill a MiG-29 before it even saw them. They knew it because of the man who had baked a cake in a Soviet kitchen. Alexander Zuyev had handed the keys to the Soviet sky to the United States. He had won his freedom. He had found his new home. But as he settled into life in California, he would learn that while you can leave the machine has a long, haunting way of finding you again. Alexander Zuyev had done what few thought possible. He had beaten the machine. In the sun-drenched streets of San Diego, California, the man who once lived in the shadow of the Kremlin was now building a new empire. He opened a consulting firm, helping the U.S. military understand the mindset of the enemies they had spent decades fearing. He learned English, not just the 4 words of a desperate fugitive, but the language of a free man. In 1992, he told his story to the world in his memoir, Fulcrum. He was a survivor, a hero of the West, a man who had successfully outrun his past. But history has a cruel sense of irony. On June 10, 2001, 12 years after his midnight flight across the Black Sea, Zuyev climbed into the cockpit of a small aircraft near Bellingham, Washington. It wasn't a high-tech MiG-29. It was a Yak-52, a simple, rugged, Soviet-made trainer aircraft. Mid-flight, the plane entered an accelerated stall. The man who had outmaneuvered the entire Soviet air defense network, who had survived a gunfight in the dark and a bleeding flight over a cold sea, couldn't pull this one out. The aircraft slammed into the ground. Alexander Zuyev was killed instantly at the age of 39. The machine he defected from was the same machine that finally claimed his life. Zuyev's defection changed the course of history. It saved American lives in the Gulf War and exposed the rot at the heart of an empire. He proved that even the most advanced technology is worthless if the men behind it are built on lies. He once asked, "Would you be happy to defend this system?" His answer was written in the blood on a Turkish runway and the secrets he handed to the world. Alexander Zuyev lived as the Soviet Union's golden boy, but he died a man who chose the truth over a comfortable lie. And in the high-stakes game of the Cold War, that truth was the most lethal weapon of all. The cockpit is empty now. The radars have gone silent. But the story of the pilot who baked a cake to steal a superpower's crown jewel, that will echo in the skies forever. If this story of courage and betrayal gripped you, hit the subscribe button and join us as we dive deeper into the shadows of history. What would you risk for freedom? Let us know in the comments.